All right, this lesson is on section 7, transformations of functions. A lot of information to get to, so we're going to dive right in. And this isn't very neat, and I apologize for that. This is kind of a summary of the whole lesson, and it's a good thing to write down. You can pause the video here and write this all down in your notes, but this is what we're going to explain to you over the course of the rest of the video. Translations, slides, up, down, left, or right, are always when you're doing addition or subtraction in a problem. Dilations are when you're making something bigger or smaller, or we're going to use the word stretch and compress. And that always happens when you multiply. And then reflection comes from negation, or throwing a negative in there. And we'll talk about all of those, but that's going to be the key transformations or changes to the position or size of the shape that we're going to deal with in this unit, or this lesson rather. Now, keys for us as we talk about things. If whatever is happening is occurring inside the parentheses, and we'll talk more about that, it's happening to the x, or it's happening left and right, or horizontally, and it always is this key word here, opposite of what you expect. If it's outside the parentheses, then it's happening to the y, or vertically, and happens as you expect. And again, we're just going to explain this, so if you need to pause here and write that down, do so. All right. This was a good explanation I used in class, talking about two golf shots that were the same, and obviously they didn't run into each other because they started at different places, which is a translation. All right, translation, again, it's to slide it from one position to the other. And so if it is an up, all right, translation, then what you're going to have is something like f of x equals x squared plus 3, and that would be up 3. There are no parentheses, and so it's happening outside parentheses. Outside parentheses affects the y. The y is up and down, or the vertical axis, and so plus, and it happens as you expect, and so plus 3 raises it up 3. If we're talking about moving it down, then it would be something like g of x equals square root of x minus 4. Now, it's key here because the minus 4 is outside of parentheses. You're going to maybe say there's no parentheses here either. But anything underneath the square root sign is also counted as in parentheses. And so only because the minus 4 is not underneath the square root sign is it outside. But it's outside parentheses, so it happens to the y, up and down. It happens as you expect, so minus 4 would push it down 4. Now let's talk about left and right. Left, all right, an example would be like h of x equals, and let's go with x plus 2 to the third power. So it's a cubic function, it's to the third power. But inside parentheses now, inside parentheses, so it happens to affect the x, which means it moves it horizontally or left or right, and everything happens inside parentheses opposite of what I expect. And so normally when I'm talking left or right, plus 2 would move it to the right 2. The opposite of that, though, would be left 2. So everything happens opposite of what I expect. So I have to know inside parentheses means changes left and right or affects the x. And I need to know inside parentheses happens the opposite of what I affect. If I'm looking at the other way then, going right, let's go back to f of x equals absolute value x minus 5. And inside the absolute value sign, they're not going to add parentheses. So inside the absolute value sign counts as inside parentheses. And so x minus 5 is inside, which means it affects the x, moves left and right, happens opposite. So minus 5 doesn't move it left, but rather moves it right 5. So we got to talk about two different things. Well, we're really going to talk about 3 for our homework assignment, because you're always going to identify the parent function. So what is the parent function here? Well, because it's squared, the parent function is quadratic. Now, the plus 2. The plus 2 is inside parentheses. Inside means it affects the x, and it's opposite what I expect. All right? So plus 2, normally on the x-axis, plus 2 would take it to the right 2, and so the opposite of right 2 would be left 2. All right? The minus 4 is outside parentheses, and so it affects the y, or up and down. It happens as you expect. And so minus 4 would be down 4. You try. All right, let's go over it here. First thing I would say is that it's a linear function because it is not x to the second or not x to the third. All right, and then it moved to the right 2 and up 1. Now, right 2 and up 1 would put it going through that place. Right 2, up 1, right 2, up 1. And so this would be the graph of it. Again, the normal parent function would go through 0, 0. And so we're taking that point, 0, 0, and moving it right 2 and up 1. And so now my graph would go through that. And so we're looking for the one where that happens, which in this case was C. And so we know from the parent function, from the U shape here, that this is a quadratic, which means it's an x squared. All right? It would usually go through 0, 0. It doesn't do that. Instead, it goes through right down here. All right? It didn't move left or right, and it moved down 5. So it would be f of x. How do I know if it's f of x? They called it f of x right here. F of x equals x squared minus 5. Right? This one is g of x, right, equals. Now I know it is cubic because of the graph shape. Okay, I look at the parent functions. Now normally it would be at 0, 0, and this is harder on cubic here. It would be like right in here. And so it moved left 1 and up 6, really. And so left 1 would be plus 1, all right, to the third because it's cubic, and then up 6 would be like that. Right? Dilations, again, going to the beginning notes, dilations are multiplied. So notice that we have a number here multiplied by the f of x, or multiplied to the f of x. We're going to talk here with dilations. It's very important. I'm going to have to know with dilations. Am I talking vertical or horizontal? So that's the first thing I got to figure out. And then am I talking about a stretch or a compression? And so this page, we're going to talk about vertical. Vertical means it's up y-axis, all right, which means it's outside parentheses. And so it could be like f of x equals 3x to the third, all right? Or it could be like f of x equals 1/4 square root x. Or it could be like f of x equals 1/2 absolute value of x. Okay? And so those are all outside the parentheses. There are no parentheses or underneath the square root sign counts. So this is 1/4 isn't underneath the square root sign. And then inside the absolute value bars counts, but the 1/2 isn't inside the absolute. So these are all outside, so they're all vertical. So because these numbers are outside, I know it's vertical. And then is it a stretch or compression? All right, well, when it's vertical, all right, I'm looking at the number here. That's what we're going to call the A number. All right, when it's vertical, if A is bigger than 1, if I multiply it by 3, it's 3 times bigger. All right, so that's going to be a stretch. Happens as I expect. Multiplying it by 3 makes it 3 times bigger. If it's less than 1, all right, multiply it by 1/4 or multiply it by 1/2, all right, it makes it smaller. Multiplying something by a half makes it half as big. All right, and so that's a compression. When it's horizontal, all right, horizontal stretch and compression, it's inside. All right, so again, the first thing I have to do here is identify the stretch vertical or horizontal, and then the next thing I have to do is figure out stretch or compression. And so what would examples be? Equals something like that, or probably a better off with something like this, or something like that. So these are all inside. The numbers here are all inside parentheses. Remember, underneath the square root sign, inside absolute value bars counts as inside parentheses. Because they're all inside parentheses, these are all inside parentheses, they're horizontal. Now, are they stretches or compressions? Everything inside parentheses is opposite. And so this A number, all right, this A number, if it's horizontal, if A is bigger than 1, I usually multiplying something by 4 makes it 4 times bigger, but this case it would be 4 times smaller. Or the way to say that is we flip the number, which means you do the reciprocal, and so it's a horizontal compression of 1/4. If A is less than 1, all right, normally multiplying something by half would make it smaller by half. In this case, because everything's opposite, it would be a stretch. And the way to say that one would be this is a horizontal stretch of 2. You flip 1 over 2 to 2 over 1, so it's a horizontal stretch of 2. This is a horizontal stretch of 3 down here in the absolute value function. Reflections. Reflections, it's a matter of where is the negative. All right. I don't love linear examples, but we'll use it since it's what they gave us here. All right. And so when the negative here is outside parentheses, that means it affects the y, which is strange here because it's on the side that I have written down as across the x-axis. But if you think of, if you change the y, it started up here, it flips down here. So you change the y from positive to negative, it goes through the x-axis. So it's always the opposite axis of what it affects. So this is outside parentheses down here. So it affects the y, which means it reflected across, or you could use the word over, the x-axis. Same thing down here then. This changed the x from a positive to a negative. So it went through or across or over the y-axis. And so because this negative is inside parentheses, it actually changed it from positive to negative, which moved it, flipped it over or across the y-axis. This was something I went over in class, and so just a quick show you, -3 squared, the negative's not inside parentheses, so the answer would be -9. -3 squared, the answer is inside parentheses, so the answer is +9. That was just answering a question in class. I left the slide there. All right, describe the dilation here. All right, well, first it wants me to all these problems now are going to want me to tell the parent function our homework, so I'm going to tell you right now, you see it's x to the first, so it's linear. All right, the negative here is outside parentheses, and so it's a reflection. Outside affects the y, which means it's over the x-axis. The 2/3 is, or 2/5 rather, the 2/5 is outside, so vertical. Vertical happens as I expect. Multiplying by a fraction makes things, I would expect to make things smaller. So it's a vertical compression by 2/5. All right. Parent function here, it's a squared, and so it's quadratic. The negative is inside parentheses, and so it's a reflection. Inside affects the x, which means it changes the x from positive to negative or goes over or across the y-axis. And then the 2/5 is bigger than 1, and so it's also inside, which means it's horizontal. Bigger than 1, I would normally think makes things bigger. Timesing 2 by 2.5 would make it 5, but everything happens opposite inside parentheses, and so it's horizontal compression, and it's getting 2.5 times smaller. I'm not going to have you write down the bi's, though, when it's a decimal, because I don't want to get into all the dynamics of that. All right. The u try here would be an absolute value function. All right. The negative is inside, and so negative inside will be a reflection over, you got to figure out what axis. The 2 inside means horizontal, and it's bigger than 1, so it's a compression. And I flip the number. So right now, if you haven't already figured out, is it going over the x-axis or y-axis? Hopefully you got that it's going over, it affects the x, so it's going over the y-axis. Again, I check this is just a review of things we've talked about. I check the exponent for the function family. It tells me whether it's linear or quadratic or cubic. All right. Now, it will eventually tell me square root, but right now you're always going to see the square root sign and you're always going to see the absolute value sign. Inside parentheses plus minus signs are horizontal. All right. Or left, right slides or shifts. Plus minus outside parentheses are vertical or up, down, slides, or shifts. And anytime we multiply, it's a dilation, which means it's a stretch or compression. You got to figure out if you're multiplying inside or outside, whether it's horizontal or vertical, stretch or compression. And negatives are reflections. You might want to add that as a side note. And so let's talk about everything going on here. We have a negative. We have a 2/3. We have a 3. And we have a 1. So those are all the things going on. The parent function would be absolute value. So let's mark that first here. The negative is way outside parentheses or outside the absolute value bars in this case. And so it's a reflection. Outside affects the y, which means it's really a reflection over or across the x-axis. The 2/3 is outside, so it's vertical. It's multiplication, so it's a dilation. It's vertical, and it means it happens as I expect. Outside, vertical, affects the y. It happens as I expect, so it's going to get 2/3. Timesing by 2/3 is making it smaller. As I expect by 2/3. Right. The +3 inside means it moves it left and right. It affects the x inside. Everything happens opposite what I expect, so +3 is left 3. The +1 is up 1. Right. There are no negatives, so there are no reflections here. The 2 is outside, so it's vertical. All right, it happens as I expect, so it's a stretch. The -3 is inside, so it moves it left and right. Everything's opposite, so it'd be right 3. And then the -5 is outside, so it happens as I expect, so it'd be down 5. Go ahead and try it in the homework. Good luck.